My name is Haley Reed, 34 years old, and for the past 13 years I've lived a life that never included family dinners, group chats, or surprise visits. I learned early that quiet is safer than chaos, and work is easier to understand than people. I run a late-night dessert business out of an industrial kitchen on the east side of Denver. Cakes, bars, pastries, whatever keeps the lights on and my mind steady. Last month, that business finally exploded in a way I never expected. Orders jumped, contracts landed, and suddenly, the numbers said something I'd never said out loud. I could leave my tiny apartment behind. So I bought a house, bigger than anything I grew up in. Bigger than anything I ever thought I'd need. A place with a kitchen that felt like a promise, and rooms I hadn't decided how to use yet. I moved in with nothing but a folding chair, a box of leftover cupcakes, and the feeling that I had crossed some invisible line between the person I'd been forced to be and the person I built on my own. For the first night in a long time, everything felt still. And then, the next morning, the past arrived on my doorstep. Literally. I hadn't seen them in 13 years, but there they were, standing outside my new front door like the gap between us had been a long weekend instead of more than a decade. They came with luggage, expectations, and the kind of confidence people only have when they believe they still own a piece of you. What happened when I cracked the door open is the reason I'm telling this story. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. It's strange how early patterns settle into a family without anyone noticing. For me, it began long before I understood the weight of being the oldest. I learned responsibility the way other kids learned instruments, through repetition. I picked up extra shifts at a local diner when I was barely old enough to drive, brought home small paychecks, and filled whatever gaps appeared in the house. No one asked me to, but it was clear who was expected to steady things. My younger sister, Maya Reed, grew up under a different sky. She had a softness that adults misread as innocence. She didn't have to explain herself because someone else always stepped in first. A scraped knee earned her sympathy. A missed assignment earned her excuses. A poor choice earned her comfort. I watched the pattern develop from the background, a place I stood so long it became familiar. My mother carried a constant worry that settled on Maya like a blanket. If Maya was tired, we all lowered our voices. If Maya was stressed, we adjusted our plans. If Maya cried, the entire household reorganized itself around the sound. I didn't resent her at the time. I simply adapted. I handled rides, chores, errands, anything that kept the air in the house from cracking. What I couldn't adapt to was the quiet shift in perception. It happened slowly, the way a table leans after years of pressure on one side. A missing wallet meant questions directed at me first. Forgotten appointments became assumptions that I hadn't passed along the correct information. Even my attempts to clarify small misunderstandings were met with a tightening expression from my mother, a look that said I was complicating things. The moment that made everything clear came during a summer afternoon when Maya misplaced a small amount of cash she'd set aside for a school trip. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover a snack at the gas station, but the way she reacted changed more than the atmosphere in the kitchen. She stood in front of our mother with tears gathering at the edges of her eyes, breathing unevenly, turning her palms upward as if asking the world why it was against her. I tried to explain I hadn't touched her money, but the room shifted. The tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed, as though I had failed some unspoken expectation. I realized then that explanations didn't matter in a place where feelings weighed more than facts. There was no malice in Maya's expression, only the subtle confidence of someone who had learned that vulnerability was a kind of currency. After that day, the household adopted a rhythm I could not influence. If Maya had a late project, it was because I didn't remind her. If she missed the bus, it was because I took too long in the morning. If she seemed anxious, it was because I hadn't made her feel supported. Most of these judgments were unspoken, but unspoken things have a way of accumulating. I retreated into work because it offered clear rules. A shift started at a certain time, ended at a certain time, and effort had visible outcomes. Home offered none of that. Any attempt to correct a false assumption only tightened the dynamic further, so I learned to let silence carry the burden. The less I resisted, the smoother things ran. That was the beginning of the distance. Not the dramatic kind that appears in a single moment, but the quiet kind that grows in the corners of a house where no one is looking. The kind you don't realize is happening until it becomes the only language the family speaks. And eventually, that language shaped everything that came after. There comes a point when a family pattern stops being invisible and becomes a weight you can no longer carry. For me, that moment arrived on a cold morning when the balance in our house finally tipped in a way I couldn't correct. I had agreed to lend my old sedan to Maya Reed so she could run a small errand before school. It wasn't the first time she had used it, but it was the first time she returned it with the front bumper dented inward and a long scrape dragging across the paint. She walked inside the house already trembling, holding her coat in a way that suggested something terrible had happened to her rather than to the car. By the time I entered the kitchen, the story had solidified. It wasn't detailed in the traditional sense, but it was shaped to fit the emotional logic everyone expected from her. I heard my name spoken in a tone that suggested I was responsible for circumstances I had never touched. There was no room for questions, no space for clarity. The conclusion had been drawn before I arrived. I stood there realizing the truth didn't have a place in the version of events already accepted. After that morning, a shift began in small but decisive ways. Holidays passed without my input. Schedules changed, plans formed, and gatherings happened that somehow never included me. I wasn't pushed out with force. I drifted out because the door kept moving just beyond where I could reach. I tried to hold on, but every attempt to explain myself only made the distance more pronounced. Eventually, I stopped trying. I packed what I owned, which wasn't much, and moved into a studio apartment across town. I thought leaving would give us space to reset. That time apart would bring clarity. But distance only made the assumptions more rigid. I became the sister who pulled away, made things complicated, and chose her own life at the expense of everyone else. None of these ideas matched the truth, but truth had stopped being a shared language. 13 years is a long time to live outside the orbit of people who once defined your world. During those years, I worked whatever jobs kept the rent paid. I brewed coffee at dawn, cleaned offices in the evenings, and learned how to mix batter in dark kitchens when the rest of the city slept. Work made sense. It never pretended to be something it wasn't. Effort produced results, and results kept me moving. Meanwhile, Maya Reed created her own mythology online. I didn't see it at first. I wasn't connected to any of the family accounts. But word travels, especially when the story is dramatic. I heard that she posted cryptic sentences about betrayal, healing, and finding strength when some people abandon you for their own comfort. She wrote about being left behind, about carrying emotional burdens alone, about loving people who didn't love her back. She never wrote my name, but she didn't need to. Everyone following her knew who she meant. It was strange watching relatives attach themselves to her narrative. They responded with prayers, encouragement, and reminders that family should forgive. They reshared her posts and sent her long messages that floated back to me indirectly through acquaintances. It was clear they had built their own version of me, an unkind silhouette created from half-heard stories and assumptions that were easier to accept than the real person I was becoming. With each year that passed, the distance settled deeper. Birthdays went unacknowledged. My mother changed her phone number without telling me. Cousins married without inviting me. Though I heard through someone else that I was mentioned in a speech as a sister who lost her way, I didn't correct any of it. I didn't have the energy to rewrite stories that people didn't want rewritten. Silence grew until it became its own environment, predictable, quiet, and strangely efficient. And within that silence, I built the beginning of a life that belonged entirely to me. Growth rarely announces itself. It arrives in quiet increments that only make sense when you look backward. My own turning point started in the corner of a shared kitchen I rented by the hour on the east side of Denver. I took the late-night slot, partly because it was cheap, and partly because no one else wanted it. Those hours gave me room to experiment with recipes, burn through batches, and learn without anyone watching. At first, my orders trickled in through text messages from coworkers and people they happened to know. 5 boxes of cookies one week, 7 the next. I measured progress by the number of ingredients I had to restock, by how many times the oven door gave off a wave of heat before dawn. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Steady felt like oxygen. The shift from hobby to business came when a local office manager placed a bulk order for a corporate event. It wasn't massive, but it required me to prepare more than I had ever attempted. I spent that week whisking batter until my hands trembled, timing each tray with precision, and labeling every box with a care that bordered on obsession. When the order was delivered, the feedback was immediate. The office called again the next month, then again 2 weeks after that. Word traveled quickly through the networks of small companies that relied on catered treats to mark celebrations or soften long meetings. Orders doubled, then tripled. I bought larger mixing bowls, sturdier containers, and a second set of baking pans so I wouldn't waste time washing between batches. I started tracking expenses and income in a notebook, calculating what I could reinvest, deciding when risk was acceptable. Eventually, the shared kitchen became insufficient. I needed more storage, more refrigeration, more space to move. Renting a dedicated kitchen was a financial stretch, but it was also the first decision that felt like an act of faith in myself. The new kitchen was small and industrial, tucked between a repair shop and a warehouse. It smelled faintly of metal and detergent, but it was mine during the hours I rented it, and that made all the difference. With more space came more orders. I added bars, cakes, and custom desserts to my menu. I organized deliveries with a schedule that required me to wake before sunrise, restock after midday, and work through evenings. For the first time in my life, exhaustion felt purposeful instead of draining. I saw numbers that hinted at sustainability. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability, something I had never experienced before. When I hired my first part-time helper, a quiet college student who handled labeling and packaging, the workload finally felt manageable. The business no longer relied solely on my hands. It had structure, rhythm, and potential. I documented everything: quantities, cost variations, customer preferences. I treated each batch like a step forward, even when it wasn't perfect. The real turning point came when a regional cafe chain reached out after tasting one of my dessert bars at a networking event. They wanted weekly deliveries across several locations. The scale intimidated me, but I recognized the opportunity it offered. After negotiating a schedule that wouldn't compromise quality, I accepted. The contract provided enough financial consistency for me to consider long-term plans I had never allowed myself to imagine. As orders increased, so did the quiet understanding that my life was shifting into something firmer, something with momentum. I saved carefully, tracked profits, reduced unnecessary expenses, and resisted the urge to expand too quickly. Each month that passed brought me closer to stability, and stability eventually brought me to a place I hadn't expected: homeownership. When I toured the house I eventually purchased, I didn't see luxury. I saw potential. A kitchen with counter space wide enough for multiple trays, a living room large enough for team gatherings, and rooms I could use for storage or quiet. Signing the papers felt surreal, not because of what the house represented, but because of the years it had taken to reach that point. Stepping into that space, I understood that the life I had built no longer resembled the one I left behind. The morning they arrived felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I had only been in the house a short time, still getting used to the silence that settled over the halls, when the sound of tires on gravel pulled me out of my routine. Movement on the security camera caught my attention. Two figures stepping out of a car with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than caution. One carried a suitcase. The other scanned the porch, as if evaluating what she believed she was entitled to. Seeing them on my screen after 13 years felt unreal. Maya Reed, my younger sister, moved with the same practiced confidence she had perfected long before adulthood. The kind that came from believing rules applied to everyone except her. Behind her stood Evelyn Reed, my mother, gripping her sweater like she expected the house to welcome her back. Neither looked uncertain. Neither hesitated. They came as though responding to an invitation no one had sent. I didn't rush to the door. I watched them longer than necessary, long enough to recognize their posture, their shared assumption, their expectation that the years of distance would bend the moment I appeared. Something in me steadied. I walked to the table near the entryway, picked up the folder I had prepared days earlier, and felt its weight settle into my hand like a promise I had made to myself. Opening the door only slightly was deliberate. I kept the gap narrow enough to maintain control, but wide enough to prevent misunderstanding. They stood directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the shine on Maya's freshly done nails and the faint irritation in my mother's expression. Neither matched the gravity of the years that had passed. Maya reached for her suitcase handle with casual certainty. She angled her body toward the threshold, as if stepping inside was a formality she didn't need my permission for. My mother positioned herself slightly behind her, the way she used to whenever she expected me to comply without protest. For a moment, they both waited for the version of me they had shaped, silent, compliant, responsible for the comfort of everyone else. Instead, I stayed still. The folder in my hand remained closed, but its presence created an invisible distance they hadn't anticipated. The dynamic shifted. Maya's confident posture faltered just enough for me to notice. My mother's expression hardened in a way I recognized from years earlier, the look she used when she believed obligation outweighed autonomy. Holding my ground felt unfamiliar and powerful. I didn't rely on raised voices or explanations. I let the boundaries speak for themselves. I placed the folder slightly forward, not offering it, not hiding it, simply acknowledging it existed. A guest license, a no trespass notice already notarized, and a ledger documenting every expense, every debt, every manipulation that had slowly cut me out of the family narrative. These documents represented a version of myself that had finally learned to write things down instead of carrying them in silence. The air between us became heavier. Maya shifted her weight, recalculating the situation. My mother's eyes moved from me to the folder, then to the narrow gap of the open door, as though realizing that the home she assumed she could enter was no longer an extension of her authority. I felt no urgency to fill the silence. It wasn't my responsibility to ease their discomfort. They waited for permission. I didn't give it. I didn't raise my voice or repeat what the documents already made clear. The boundary existed whether they accepted it or not. Eventually, I stepped back, not to invite them in, but to place the folder on the small console table behind me. I positioned it deliberately, a reminder that every decision moving forward would be written, measured, and chosen by me alone. The moment held steady, unbroken, each of us understanding what the years apart had changed. By the time the door finally shut behind them, the house felt different. Not quieter. Quieter had been my normal for years, but defined, as if the walls themselves understood the boundary I had drawn. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the adrenaline settle before returning to the kitchen. It didn't take long for my phone to vibrate. The timing was predictable, almost rehearsed, the way trouble always traveled through the same channels. The first alerts came from cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Screenshots of posts appeared in rapid succession. I didn't open the messages, but the previews were enough to make their intent clear. Maya had wasted no time reshaping the narrative. Photos of my front porch were paired with captions that framed her arrival as an act of hope and my refusal as cruelty. She understood the digital stage as well as she had understood our family's emotional landscape. Sympathy flowed toward her with familiar speed. I didn't respond. Engaging would have pulled me back into the script she had controlled for years. Instead, I opened my laptop, drafted a short email, and sent it to the relatives still using the same addresses as before. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a plea. It was a boundary written plainly. Communication limited to email, no discussions involving money or housing, no accusations or emotional barbs. Anything outside those terms would be ignored. I didn't justify it. I didn't soften it. I simply established the rules I should have set 13 years earlier. More messages came. A few relatives sent paragraphs accusing me of abandoning family values. Someone claimed I had forgotten where I came from. Another insisted I owed Maya an opportunity to get her life on track. The familiar tone of moral obligation echoed through each message, but this time it didn't shake me. They were recreating a play I no longer acted in. Not long after, my mother sent a single-line email. No greeting, no punctuation. The kind of message meant to provoke guilt. You've broken your sister's heart. It carried the same weight she had always relied on. Guilt disguised as concern. Obligation framed as morality. I closed the email without replying. Later that evening, when I saw her name appear again in my inbox, I felt nothing sharp. Just a quiet recognition of patterns she still believed could influence me. She wrote about sacrifice, about raising 2 daughters alone, about all the times she felt unsupported. Every sentence pointed back to the same idea: that my stability was something she deserved access to, and denying it was an act of betrayal. I let the message sit. No response would change her version of events, and I had finally accepted that I wasn't responsible for correcting her narrative. Instead, I drafted a separate document, one outlining the steps I would take if they continued to appear uninvited. It wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Contact information for a process server, references to property laws, instructions for maintaining records. Creating it felt like reinforcing a foundation I had long ignored. The following morning arrived without drama, but the digital noise continued. Maya posted vague statements about toxic relatives, gathering sympathy from people who didn't know either of us. I didn't check her profile, yet snippets reached me through notifications and forwarded messages. Her pattern was predictable. Position herself as wounded, imply betrayal, wait for validation. It had worked for her since adolescence, and she saw no reason to stop now. I spent the day at my kitchen counter, reviewing invoices, updating supply orders, and planning deliveries for the week. Work had always steadied me, but now it served another function: proof that my life no longer depended on the approval or involvement of those who misunderstood me. Everything I had built existed outside their assumptions. As evening settled over the house, the air felt balanced again. Not because the situation had resolved, but because I had reclaimed the space where their expectations once lived. The documents on my console table remained untouched, waiting for the moment they might be needed. I didn't hope they would be unnecessary. Hope had nothing to do with it. What mattered was preparation. Time has a way of testing boundaries long after the day you draw them. For me, the real test came quietly, not in some dramatic confrontation, but in the way my life held its shape after I chose not to open the door. Mornings still started with production lists and delivery routes. My staff still waited on clear instructions. The oven still needed preheating, mixers still needed scraping, bills still needed to be paid. Nothing collapsed when I stopped letting my family's chaos bleed into my schedule. The world stayed upright without their constant presence, and that stability told me more than any apology ever could. About 3 months after they had appeared on my porch, the noise around them began to fade. The frantic screenshots from relatives slowed to a trickle. Emotional posts that had once been shared and reshared lost momentum. Then an email from Maya arrived. Short and strangely practical. The subject line mentioned work, not heartbreak. The body of the message asked if I knew any places hiring for flexible shifts. There were no accusations hiding between the lines, no attempts to reopen old wounds. I didn't invite her into my bakery. Instead, I replied with a simple list of agencies and local shops that I knew were hiring, then returned to my spreadsheets without waiting to see what she did with the information. A few weeks later, another message appeared, this time with no text at all, just a single photo attached. Maya stood in a plain uniform, an employee badge clipped to her shirt, fluorescent lights casting the kind of tired glow you only get from service jobs. It was the first image I'd seen of her where she wasn't framed as the center of a tragedy. I saved the file to a folder on my computer and left it there. I didn't treat it as proof that she had become a different person. I let it stand as quiet evidence that whatever changes she chose to make from that point on were her responsibility, not the result of me stepping in to rescue her. Around the 6-month mark, my mother reached out again, this time with a message that felt stripped of performance. She asked if she could see the house once. No sermon, no list of sacrifices attached, just a plain request. I answered with clear terms, a specific day, a specific time, only her. When she arrived, she walked through the rooms with the careful attention of someone moving through a place they don't quite know how to categorize. She noticed the organized pantry, the lined-up baking trays, the absence of clutter that had once swallowed every flat surface in the home we used to share. We sat at the kitchen table while she commented on small, practical things, the sturdiness of the chairs, the depth of the sink, the fact that I had enough plates for a full table of people who actually chose to be there. She didn't mention the years of silence. I didn't ask for explanations. We both understood that no combination of words could undo the pattern that had made me the problem and Maya the story. What we had instead was a brief moment of honest distance, two adults occupying separate lives, meeting in a place that belonged fully to one of them. When she left, she paused with her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. It wasn't a claim or a blessing. It felt more like a small, reluctant acknowledgement that whatever authority she once assumed over my space had quietly expired. Time did what it always does. It kept going. Nearly a year after I signed the closing papers, I heard from a mutual acquaintance, not from family, that Maya had been promoted to a shift supervisor position. The news was presented casually, like any other workplace update. Her online presence had changed too, or so I was told. Fewer vague posts about betrayal, more tired jokes about late shifts and caffeinated survival. The story she fed the world no longer revolved entirely around being wronged. Whether her private narrative about me softened or hardened was something I chose not to monitor. It was no longer my job to track her version of events. Through all of this, I stayed outside their orbit. I didn't resume the role of quiet fixer, financial backup, or emotional sponge. On the rare occasions I chose to help, I did it the way I handle any business decision, specifically, intentionally, with limits. Covering a clearly defined bill, sending information that could be used or ignored, and nothing beyond that. The rest of my energy went into the people standing in front of me now. Employees who arrived early and told the truth. Neighbors who asked how I was doing without digging for gossip. Friends who cared about my well-being without needing a villain to justify their loyalty. My house gradually became a place for end-of-week potlucks, low-stakes game nights, and quiet debriefs over leftover pastries after brutal rushes. The rooms that once echoed with absence filled with a kind of laughter that didn't require me to shrink or absorb damage to be allowed in the room. The folder of documents near the entryway stayed where I had left it, ready but untouched. Knowing it was there didn't make me hard. It made me clear. I stopped rehearsing defenses in my head, stopped building imaginary courtrooms where I won arguments no one else would ever hear. I accepted that some people would always cling to a version of me that made their choices easier to live with. My peace no longer depended on them updating that image. It depended on me refusing to trade my sanity for proximity. Looking back, I don't see any of this as a clever revenge arc. There was no moment where I won in a way that would satisfy a movie script. What happened was quieter and, to me, more important. I stopped letting other people's denial dictate the shape of my days. I learned that love without boundaries is not generosity. It is erosion. I learned that you can wish someone well without giving them a key to your front door, your bank account, or your nervous system. I learned that being called selfish by people who benefit from your exhaustion is not a reliable measure of your worth. If there is anything I hope you carry from this, it is the simple permission to close doors that only ever open to strip you of yourself. You are allowed to protect the life you built, even when the hands knocking are familiar. You are allowed to choose quiet, honest peace over a performance that keeps everyone else comfortable while you disappear. Thank you for staying with my story, wherever you are, and whatever the clock looks like where you're watching from. If it stirred something in you about your own boundaries, you can keep that reflection private, share it with someone you trust, or leave a piece of it here so others feel less alone. However you decide to respond, I hope you remember that protecting yourself is not cruelty. It is the beginning of living in a way that finally makes sense.